And welcome to Meet the Writers. My guest today was raised as part of a literary family in New York City and Cape Cod. Her debut novel, The Paper Palace, was a #1 New York Times bestseller in the US, a Sunday Times bestseller in the UK, and was longlisted for the Women's Prize. She's had a prolific career across books, magazines, and television. She's just published her first collection of poetry, What the Deep Water Knows. Miranda Cowley Heller, welcome to Meet the Writers.
I am so happy to be here.
Now, we're talking in Adelaide in a kind of ridiculous casino hotel. And I have just been so thrilled to be introduced to your book, The Paper Palace, while we're here. Now, you're one of the speakers at Adelaide Festival, but you're from the United States, and I wanted to start talking a little bit about your life, because everything you've written in both The Paper Palace and in your forthcoming book of poems is very, very personal, and you get the feeling that really you're writing through your life. And I think just to try and understand who you are and what your life is. So obviously brought up in America. Tell me about your parents.
So I was brought up in a family of sort of bohemian wasps, sort of artists and writers and painters and editors. My mother's side of the family is very old Bostonians. And my stepfather is a painter. My father's father, very different immigrants they lived outside of Pittsburgh. But my grandfather was a poet and an editor. And my father was a book editor. So there was sort of these two sides. My family was the one, we had cousins, for example, and we all kind of grew up in the same place in New York City and on Cape Cod, which is where the Paper Palace is set. My family was the one where, or rather, my cousins, let's say, sailed and did tennis and skiing. I took solfège classes and for musical theory, and had to pose in the landscape for my stepfather naked, actually, all of us children, as a sort of endless déjeuner sur l'herbe life. So it was playing classical music outside on the sort of pine needles under the trees in the summer, and in no way was our life the same as the rest of the family on a certain level like that. And so we sort of moved around in the summers to follow the motif, actually, wherever my stepfather wanted to paint. It was a very bohemian lifestyle, and yet my mother's family is very, as I say, old Bostonian. My grandfather still basically had an English accent and said things about one of his 5 marriages, for example. From that marriage there was no issue, that kind of thing. So you sort of, and yet he was also a painter, and my mother's mother similarly was a painter. They met studying with Léger in Paris. So, and both came from these quite, old waspy families. So it was that sort of moment in time, that sort of night of the iguana time for them, I guess, and sunbathing topless in cateches, or whatever that means to anybody, including me.
I mean, it sounds terribly glamorous.
Glamorous was not what it was, mainly because we were very poor. My stepfather was a painter. My mother was an opera singer. And the families had sort of lost everything in generations before. So I was always on scholarship, full scholarship, where I went. And yet we were part of this world where I didn't want to bring anybody home, let's say in New York, to our apartment, because I was in these schools, for instance, where I don't know what the equivalent would be, sort of if you were at Westminster or St. Paul's or something, but you're on full scholarship and all of your friends have beautiful places in Chelsea, and it was not glamorous in that sense. What it was in retrospect was very full of life and art, But at the time, the message was, if you're not great at it, don't even bother. And that was absolutely, if you're not a great musician, then there's no point. If you're not the best at what you do in the arts, which is the only thing that matters. So that was very much a part of it too.
You've talked about your grandfather and his several marriages. You've talked about your own stepfather. So was divorce and different partners and floating parents, I suppose, part of that?
Oh, God, yes. First of all, so just to quickly go back, my mother's side of the family, both of her parents were married 5 times, her father and her mum. My own father's side of the family, very, very different. My grandparents, his parents, were the rock of my childhood because they were very much that couple who stayed together. Although, having said that, my grandfather's first wife left him for the poet Hart Crane. I don't think she might have made the right decision, Peggy. But then my grandfather and my grandmother were married until their 90s, until they died. So that was a sort of solid side. My father, however, went on to marry, he married 3 times. So yes, so divorce is a very, very big theme really in the novel and in my life, absolutely. That sense of where do you belong? And when you don't feel that you do anywhere else. And for me, because of sort of the economics of it, that my mother was struggling and so on, and at that time even, she needed a man to keep her afloat, as had her mother. My stepfather, who I absolutely adore, by the way, he moved into our house, and she would say things like, well, you better behave because you're only here sort of on sufferance. And
to you?
Yes, to us. And also I behaved very badly because I had horrible temper tantrums, probably partly because of that when I was very teensy. And then my father's wife, she was 25 years old, and the last thing she wanted were these horrid little brats. And so he moved out to the suburbs, and she didn't really want us around at all. Which ultimately enriched. This is the funny thing about retrospect, isn't it? And memory is that so she was the daughter of John Cheever, and because she didn't want us around, we'd go for our father's weekends and be dumped at the Cheever's house instead. And so that there's obviously a version of that comes into the Paper Palace, not the reality of it, but a sort of a nod to that. But that meant that, in my childhood, I was spending my weekends with John Cheever instead of his wonderful daughter, Susan Cheever, who's an incredible writer and we love.
As a child, though, so difficult with parents having different partners and presumably step-siblings.
Well, I had a step-brother, but he didn't move in with us until, I want to say he was 11 or 12 when he moved in with us. And then on my father's side, I just have 2 younger sisters who I absolutely adore and get along with incredibly well. So that's nice. So there's lots of girls, and a lot of my family is full of strong women. There's many sisters of my mom's, and then same with me. So it's definitely a matriarchy in my family, which I appreciate. But then a lot of these men who are as well, muscular in their temperaments.
Another constant seems to be the Cape and water. Tell us about your relationship with that part of the country. So Cape Cod and the Outer Cape, which is where the novel takes place, or the 24 hours in the novel takes place, is where I grew up every summer of my entire life, on this pond that's very, very close to the ocean, 10-minute walk, but it's a freshwater lake, in fact, a glacial lake. And in this part of the world that you almost can't imagine is still there, particularly on Cape Cod, because Cape Cod, one thinks of yachts and lawns. And this is absolutely the opposite. It's rough and only dirt roads and paths. And if you don't know your way in, you're not going to find your way out, So my grandfather actually built a lot of these roads. And my mother then grew up there. My
our whole family and all of the offspring of my mother's father sort of congregate there from all over where they ended up, whether it's England or Canada. And so that became the center for me and the place of safety, in fact, because we just, I think place is so important. And I think where, everybody has, wherever that may be, they're sort of what's their true north. And for me, the backwoods is and was that. And it was the kind of place you came to and you brought a pair of shoes and then you never wore them again for 3 months in the summer. And we were very lucky because my parents were artists. We could just go for the whole summer. Totally unsupervised. It was the 60s and 70s. And again, all the parents are naked all the time. It was very much frowned upon to wear a bathing suit. And so the culture of this place was also very a big imprint, not just the landscape, but also the culture of it. And just to sort of say a funny story is that I have a friend who also grew up there, and we were talking, and I said, her mother, who I'm talking about, and they would always sort of camp out on the far end of our pond, which, why they had to come to our pond. And, she said, I don't know, I can't remember what I said. She was the one with the enormous bush. And she went, oh, now I know who you're talking about.
Identified by pubic hair, fantastic.
Exactly.
Water, of course, you were swimming at the pond
always.
all the time.
All the time, swimming. So if it's a quite a long swim across the pond, but when you get to the far end or take a rowboat or a canoe or whatever it is, you come almost immediately to sand dunes, high cliffs of dunes that go straight down to the Atlantic. So you're always in and out of salt and fresh water and swimming constantly. And so that is very much a part of, I think, my life in so many ways, freshwater and saltwater, as it turns out. Although I no longer can swim in the oceans on Cape Cod because they've become the largest cluster of great whites in the world besides South Africa, has in the last about 12 years, bizarrely. So I go in up to my knees and run out. But in those days, you'd just get in the water and swim straight out into the Atlantic at age 10, P.S., no parents. Parents didn't come with us to the beach. They didn't, we'd ride on, we'd hitchhike. I mean, I was hitchhiking when I was 10 years old. It's kind of madness, but that's what everybody did.
Yeah. Now, Heller, of course, is a very famous literary name and also televisual name. Tell us about the Heller family and your involvement.
Well, I am married into, my husband was Bruno Heller, who's a television and screenwriter.
Probably best known for The Mentalist.
And also for Rome, which was a wonderful series on HBO and the BBC, if anybody remembers that. It was a fantastic series. But yes, The Mentalist and several others. And then his sister Zoe Heller is a British novelist as well and journalist. Now teaching at Princeton. So on that side, quite a few relatives as well, or through marriage. My aunt was married to Martin Amis and so on and so forth. But in fact, the literary side of my family is my father's side. And so Malcolm Cowley, who was my grandfather, was sort of the Boswell of 20th century literature in a way, and chronicler, as well as a literary critic, editor, and so on. And when Faulkner won the Nobel Prize, he said, there's only one person I owe this entire prize to, and that's Malcolm Cowley, who got him he was out of print, and my grandfather kind of rediscovered him and was his editor, discovered Kerouac, and he was the person who, to me, was, my North Star in that sense, and who I went to for any kind of advice about writing. So, yeah.
Now, one of the reasons I'm asking about your husband is that your marriage is now over, and the reason that's relevant is that this book, The Paper Palace, which was a #1 New York Times bestseller, I mean, you've sold, I don't know how many millions of copies.
Well over 2 million, so that's not bad.
that's pretty good, over 2 million copies sold. But you were writing this book, which is about infidelity, it's about divorce, it's about step families, it's about water, it's about growing up on the Cape, about all of the things we've talked about. But at the same time, marriage was disintegrating. And many people who know this have read the book and feel that your marriage ending was as a direct result of you having written the book and written something that perhaps made your husband feel that your heart was elsewhere. I think that's not the reality, though, is it?
That's absolutely not the reality. I remember a conversation with his sister. She said, well, why should we believe you? And I said, and for anybody who's read the novel, I said, well, the Jonas character who she's having the affair with is a kind of idealized man. He's the man in your head. He's the man who you're the only thing he loves in the entire world, no matter what, will leave his wife for, blah, blah, even when you're in your 50s. You know, I mean, there's no, right, he's that guy. And I said, because you know your brother, and I, as well as I do, and if Jonas existed, I would have left Bruno so quickly. I mean, wouldn't you have? And she kind of took a pause and went, oh. I said, P.S., I'm not a complete idiot. If I were doing this, why on earth would I write a novel about it, right, in real time? I mean, we are not insane people, right? I will only say that that in the sense that everybody wants to read into fiction memoir, no, that's not what was going on. But the idea of the life in one's head, the fantasy versus the life you lead, was very much an idea that I had started out with.
The other major theme that runs through this book is abuse, particularly of children, and I wondered if that was something that had clouded your life.
It's interesting. Yes and no. So I didn't personally, this is not autobiographical in that sense. My mother experienced it, definitely. There were moments in time, but it's not about something that happened to me. I was thinking about this question, actually, and I was thinking about that the fact is that the worst sort of sexual abuse, for instance, that I ever experienced was after I left home. And in my late, you think about all these things that are talked about now, but, having to jump out of moving cars when I was hitchhiking to escape somebody, or being date raped in college, or all of these things that I don't know, somehow or other we accepted that this was normality in the, I don't know, 80s or late 70s. 90s, God knows how long, until we all suddenly went, hang on a second. So I had lots of very scary things happen in my life afterwards, but there was a sort of a darkness and a sense of shadows and shadowy men. I will say this, that my father he's long dead, so of liver failure. But my father had a roommate after my parents got divorced, who was his best friend, and who, I definitely liked to, let's just call it, tickle us. And I was 4, 5, 3, 4, 5. My sister's 3 years older than me. That was probably, there's a sort of he was the most charming man, and he'd throw us cookies and we'd jump on the beds and, all of the things one expects. Yes and no, I would say. What happens in the novel is not the literary version of what happened to me. But people make assumptions that everything is linear, and I would say it's more experiential and how it all comes together.
I found it absolutely fascinating, all of these different themes coming together, but to the point where I really couldn't put the book down. I just sat and read it almost at one sitting. And part of the joy of it, I think, is the structure and the way you fiddled with time. Just tell us how that works.
So the novel is told it's one woman's life story told in 50 years and 24 hours. And it started with an idea that came from the arts, in fact, which was that growing up in a family of artists and painters, and I then lived with a painter, and my sister's married to a painter. I would go to these museums, or they would have these conversations and talk about how plastic Titian was, or how plastic Velázquez was. And I know quite a lot about painting, but I just did not understand this concept. And when it was finally explained to me in a way that I got it, this man that I was living with, this wonderful painter, he said, okay, so he said, think of an apple. He said, I'm going to give you a bad example. There's, let's say, sort of Andy Warhol's apple, where he paints what his mind tells him an apple looks like, or somebody's apple, where it's sort of, maybe there's a little worm coming out of the side, right? And then there's Cézanne's apple, let's say, and he doesn't see the apple. He sees all these teensy specks and motes, and he never sees apple, but apple emerges from all these tiny moments. And so it's what you think something is in your mind, in the mind's eye, and then what it actually is in reality. And that conversation led to the Paper Palace, strangely, because I thought, well, how would you do that in another art form? And then how could you tell that story? And so that's where the sort of idea of the two men came from, because that was a natural way. Of course, it's about her, not about men in that sense. But the life she always has thought she wanted in her head, and the life she's had with this wonderful, amazing husband, but still always carrying the what if. And then the what if, you actually suddenly it's available to you. Now what do you do, right? And just to recap ever so slightly, the novel, I hope, it starts with Elle being unfaithful, as it were, or sort of metaphorically the night before the 24 hours, having jumped off a cliff and waking up going, what have I done? And now what do I do? And the 50 years tells the reader through her point of view, because it's all first-person point of view, how she did end up. And it's two perspectival stories that actually then meet as she's on the edge of the cliff the night before and about to jump, so that you truly do understand, I hope, the complexity of her life, and instead of going, oh, what a horrible woman, who would do such a thing, you think, oh, I get it. I understand how complex it is.
I mean, I absolutely don't want us to reveal what happens at the end, but there is a choice, and many readers I've seen in various reviews are confused. They're not quite sure which way she goes. In my mind, it's clear. Was it clear in your mind, and when did it become clear?
And one of the main things about writing the book was I had absolutely no idea what she was going to do, but then I had absolutely no idea what the story was going to be from ever. And when we talk a bit about the poetry, it's sort of, that's what taught me how to always embrace the blank page and just go. So I never knew who she was going to choose. And in fact, I thought I knew about 3 or 4 pages from the end of the novel. And then it changed. And I literally didn't make the choice for her. And when I did, I thought, oh, Christ, because that's not what I would have done. And that's the funny thing about when you get so deep into something. I also just didn't want to, if you're always there's always going to be a tell if you know what the choice is going to be. And it was important to me that this was a life unraveling in real time, as it were.
I want to talk about the poetry briefly. We don't have a great deal of time. It seems to me reading the poems, it's very, very, they are companion volumes, the book and the poems very much echo all of the themes we're seeing in the book.
I think that's absolutely the case, and most of the poetry, I would say a lot of it, was written long before the novel, and in fact I would say led me to be able to write the novel, which I had started the first maybe 2 chapters long before, and kept writing and rewriting. And I went back to poetry, which had been my first love, and I finally got to this place of going, oh, right, I can access poetry. You access through your dream state in a way. You're never, for me anyway, you're not looking for something. You're not digging on purpose. You're unearthing. And so I began to just go, all right, as long as I just never have any idea what I'm about to do tomorrow or what comes next. I would always, for the next page, open up a new document when I was writing the novel. The freedom and the understanding that for me the poetic voice was the same as the fiction voice was what enabled me to stop editing, thinking. I never looked back. I didn't go back and rewrite. I just wrote, and I had a musical background, and I think that leads a lot back to the question of the structure of the novel, that it sort of has a sense of movements. And so I would just sort of follow that sense. And it's interesting because I think when you talk about poetry and fiction, because there are so many similarities, and P.S., a lot of the poetry ended up in the novel, funnily enough, quite literally, because I wasn't thinking I was going to publish some of this poetry, and I would go back to it for kind of inspiration. That poetry as a form, if we are talking about what's personal, right, it can tell a story, and fiction tells a story. No matter what, poetry is always about oneself. The story has nothing to do with it because it's transmuted and it's translated and it's alchemized, right? But it's always personal. So when you're looking for something in it, it's going to be in some level personal. Doesn't mean literal, and it's so much more revealing. And yet I allowed myself to bring that into the novel and the natural world, I guess, and trauma, and inherited trauma, and to be able to sort of look at those more dreamlike parts of ourselves, you know? And I think in the little bits and pieces that make up the 50 years in the novel, like a poem, each one is a sort of metaphor for her. It's one of the slides from her memory, her life. You know, I have this theory that each of us has one of those old-fashioned slide carousels, and that's the stories of the reasons. It's what we tell our friends. This is why I'm like this. That's it. You have these memories, these stories. That doesn't matter if they're true because they're still your slide carousel, right? And you say, you know, when I was 5, I was at the zoo with my father, and I lost him, and I took this man's hand, and I looked up, and it wasn't my father, and he had a hat on or whatever. You go, oh, you know, what I felt wasn't fear but shame, or what I felt wasn't shame but abandonment, or I've never been able to look at that hat like that again without feeling, you know, that I was unloved, or whatever that thing is. That is the one image that sticks with you. That's your slide, right? And each of those slides put together, they're completely random, but they equal you as far as you know yourself. And so the slides, the moments of Elle's history in the novel, that's her slides. And they may seem random, obviously they aren't. And in a way, for me, the poems are my slides, I guess, yeah.
I think that's really beautiful, and The Paper Palace is an incredible book. Miranda Cowley Heller, thank you so much for talking to me.
Thank you so much for allowing me to talk to you. It's a great honor.
Miranda Cowley Heller, thank you very much indeed. And What the Deep Water Knows, the collection of poetry, is published by Penguin. You've been listening to Meet the Writers, thanks to the producer Steph Chungu. You can download this show and previous episodes from our website or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thank you for listening.